Hello and welcome. My name is Jenna, and I'm here today with Sumit, Emily, Eli, and Grace, aka the Groovy Smoothie. And today we will be talking about the supply chain issues revolving around fertilizer. So, our topic is fertilizer shortages, as stated prior. We will be discussing in further depth the international fertilization shortage in further depth. This shortage that has dried up supply across the world. These issues have created a widespread of other issues in numerous industries. This has caused farmers to fear for their crops and find alternatives that may or may not work. To further discuss this issue, I will be handing off the topic to Eli.
Yeah, to make sure that we understand how this is an issue, it's first important to understand what fertilizer is and what role it plays in the production of crops around the world. First off, nitrogen fertilizer is is the most common fertilizer that is used to grow crops around the world. It is made up primarily of phosphorus, potassium, and obviously nitrogen. And the fertilizer acts as a sort of vitamin for the soil to make sure that these plants are getting the nutrients they need to grow and eventually feed the entire world. Um, so right off the bat, right now in the world, there is less nitrogen fertilizer being produced for a multitude of reasons. This has been an issue for the last few years, but the Russian-Ukraine conflict has I guess, pushed everything further down, and everything's sort of starting to spiral. The one of the main issues that the industry is facing is that only a handful of countries are responsible for a majority of the production of fertilizer. So Russia and Belarus are two neighboring countries, and they account for more than 40% of global exports of the crop nutrient potash, which is one of the big ingredients in nitrogen fertilizer. So if obviously the Russian-Ukrainian conflict is creating a lot of issues. There's been a blockade put around Ukraine, and so those exports to other countries has been or have been slowed down throughout the last few months. Um, if you want to go ahead and hit next. So another issue that's been happening is, well, from that lack of exports, is that farmers are unable to obtain the necessary levels of fertilizer that they need to successfully have a good harvest and maintain production levels that they've seen in the past. So that limited supply has raised prices significantly and pushed a lot of farmers out of the market for the normal amounts of fertilizer that they normally purchase. Um, and it's a little more complicated than just building more fertilizer refineries. That is a very long and drawn out process that's pretty complicated and just takes a while to complete. So while that's being sort of put into place right now with the shortage that's going on, those refineries won't be up and running for many years down the road. This shortage of fertilizer and farmers not being able to buy their normal amounts of fertilizer is causing them to switch to crops that don't need as much fertilizer. So one example of that is groundnut. Farmers are having to switch from corn and soybeans, which are massive staples in the global food production process that are seen in many products, and they're having to switch to less useful crops like groundnut because without fertilizer, as you can see on the slide, there was a research study done at Iowa State University that showed that so in a field without fertilizer, only 60 bushels of corn would grow, but in a field with fertilizer, it was 200 bushels of corn. So it's a pretty massive difference that could end up leading to a national food shortage that will be discussed in the next slide.
Why is this important? This is important because we all need food, and fertilizer helps grow food, as Eli brought up earlier. So without fertilizer, only 60 bushels are grown, and with fertilizer, 200 can be grown. So that's only a 30% output without fertilizer. That affects the resource utilization as it's lowered, and it leaves production short of its usual performance. And as you can see to the graph on the right, this causes prices to increase as the supply is constrained, and that means food consumption demand is also going up, but the supply can't match it. And as Eli also brought up earlier, this means farmers are required to switch to different crops that aren't as beneficial to customers or as profitable to farmers. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are also the three best and most common gases and trifecta used to make a fertilizer. And all three of those are being harder to export because of the current conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And last year, over 1 billion people were hungry, according to the UN. And that's not really being helped by the fertilizer shortage, as COVID was also a big reason for the famine last year. And this fertilizer shortage is just exacerbating the problem.
So when looking at the topics we've discovered in class, there are several topics that stand out as fitting for the fertilizer shortage, although there were three that were most logical to us. The first being supply constrained processes. A supply constrained process is when there is more of a demand for a good or service than what can be supplied. In this case, the fertilizer shortage is nothing far from this concept at all. As demonstrated, there's a continuous growth for the demand of fertilizer by farmers. Since there are numerous lockdowns and exports and lack of resources, there's not enough fertilizer supply to reach said demand. The second topic is stockout probability. As it may be implied, this is the concept of the probability that a good is out of stock or unavailable. Specifically for the situation, once again, fertilizer is the good in question. It should be noted that stockout probability and the supply constraint process at hand are closely correlated. As more and more orders remain unfulfilled, the stockout probability continues to rise. Since the fertilizer shortage is creating quite disruption in the supply chain, the odds of fulfilling all fertilizer demand is slim, making its unavailability and stockout probability reach an all-time peak. Finally is safety inventory, which is the extra inventory on hand if resources or products were to be out of stock or become unavailable overall. In the grand scheme of things, a safety inventory can help with any fluctuations that may occur. For the fertilizer shortage, a lack of inventory is what is most concerning and prevalent. Most farmers are experiencing the lack of safety inventory for two reasons. The first being they had no inventory of fertilizer to pull from in the first place, and the second being they have already dug into their safety inventory and ultimately is diminishing. Both reasonings only continue to feed the skyrocketing demand for the resources at hand.
So while it is important to know what a supply constraint process is and how it might relate to this issue, it's also important to understand how a bottleneck might apply to the process as well. So a bottleneck in a process is what produces the least amount compared to the other resources in the process. So in this case, it's the production and transportation of the fertilizer. And there are some things that can be done to combat a bottleneck. For example, here, other production plants could be modified to produce fertilizer, or other production plants that don't typically produce fertilizer could be modified to produce it. But as Eli mentioned earlier, that does take quite a while to do. And some alternative options could be using different countries that produce fertilizer, but that also puts a strain on those countries as the demand might increase more for them when they already have a decreased supply. And because these issues have happened recently and there isn't too much of an end in sight, it's also valuable to look at the long-term effects that this shortage could have, specifically on the farmers and food production. So while relying on other countries for fertilizer could be a solution now, it could not be a solution in the future if Russia continues to struggle with the supply, and the situation may worsen. So as costs increase, they cut into the profits of the farmers. And if you look at the graph to the right, there are three separate areas that are worth looking at, which are the zero profit point, the shutdown point, and the shutdown zone.
So at the shutdown point, the farmer will be operating at a short-term loss, which doesn't necessarily mean they need to shut down at that point. It just means they can't be there for a prolonged period of time. But then when they get to the shutdown zone, that's where they may be faced with stopping production because the costs outweigh the profits so much, and there isn't much of a positive outlook for the future.
We'd like to thank everyone for listening today, and thank you.
10.5 minutes.
Perfect.